Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to a very important session, panel discussion, which is on the role of data and evidence in policymaking. Since the morning, we've talked about data and evidence and how important it is for policymakers to have evidence about what they're saying, what they want to change, what they want to improve. And so we're going to do a deep dive into how data impacts on policymaking. Now, the gender equality strategy that we have recognizes that women are a heterogeneous group, not homogeneous, heterogeneous, lots of intersectionality there, and discrimination based on a person's age, disability, migrant background, racial, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic background as well. And although we've been collecting data on this, EIGE has been doing so as well, not enough is there yet, so much more needs to be done. And the questions we're going to be asking are, how do we increase the profile and relevance of gender statistics and equality data? How can we increase trust in facts and statistics? And how can we collaborate across sectors and across silos? So to discuss this and give us much more information on this, we have a fantastic panel. We're going to kick off with Ligia Nobrega and Jolanta Reingard. They're from EIGE, and they're going to talk to us about what EIGE is doing in terms of data and intersectionality. We then have Rosalina Lacheva. Thank you for being here, Rosalina, from the high-level subgroup on equality data from the Fundamental Rights Agency. We have Estefania Alaminos Aguilera joining us online. She's from Eurostat. We also have Pirko Malamaki, a European Disability Forum. Pirko, thank you for joining us as well. And Ilaria Toder from the Euro-Central Asian Lesbian Community. We also have two commentators, as the last time, Lesia Radelecki from the European Commissioner for Equality, Helena Dalli's cabinet. No picture for her there, but we are here. It's fine. We know who you are. And Kim Smuter, European Network Against Racism. We're going to kick off with a presentation by Ligia and Jolanta, but I do want to say one thing to you. I've been asked to say this to you. So those of you who are from the MEDIC group, there's a session going on in the studio, so you may want to just find out if you need to be there. Otherwise, please stay and listen to our fantastic conversation on data and evidence in policymaking. So I'm going to give you this part of the stage, and Ligia, you're going to kick off.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be here and start the session. So
we need to give you sound.
Yes. Do I have sound?
Yeah.
Okay, good. This commitment to collecting, producing, and disseminating statistics to support well-informed policymaking has been already a long-standing one within the European Union institutions, namely to support gender-sensitive policies. This was already reiterated by the European Parliament, by the Council conclusions. More recently, as our mediator was mentioning, the Commission strategy for gender equality commits to integrate a gender perspective into all its major initiatives. In this way, it will allow to maximize the potential of all women and men, all boys and girls, in all their diversity. This importance of having gender statistics, of having evidence for the advancement of gender equality policies has also been highlighted in some major, that we all know, EU and worldwide international commitments, such as the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030, and also a long-standing commitment to which the EU has been quite faithful, which is the Beijing Platform for Action. Both of them call for the collection, dissemination, production of sex disaggregated data. And this should serve to support the planning and evaluation of policies, and afterwards, as I already said, to allow to have more gender-sensitive policies. So a set of good intentions. Thank you. I have been a bit with a bad throat. So what are we talking about? How do we approach gender statistics? Sorry, I forgot. Yeah. So gender statistics, it's not a discrete area of statistics, but it's rather an area that cuts across all the traditional fields of statistics. So this cross-cutting perspective, it's already there, or should be there. And they should reflect the life experiences and the particular situation of women and men. The concepts and definitions are to reflect this diversity, and also the methods that we use for collecting the statistics should take into consideration the stereotypes, the social norms, cultural factors that very often induce into gender biases if this gender perspective is not there. So they also should be collected and presented, disaggregated by sex, and this is as a primary and overall classification system. Still, we have a lot of challenges ahead. And so this is the setting, these are the good intentions, but we can notice, and it has been quite clear since the beginning of this forum, that there is a lack of a global and a coordinated strategy for having this engender of the European statistics or the official statistical systems afterwards. And this statement, as we said so, is even more problematic if we think, and we have been discussing here very specific areas, like gender-based violence. For instance, if you don't consider a very simple thing like having specific training for interviewers who are supposed to ask women about their intimacy or about their experiences of intimate partner violence, for example, very, very often you will not obtain an accurate result about the situation afterwards. You also have to consider the do no harm principle. So you are interviewing people, you are disturbing this person, you are going to put this person out of the balance where she or he is. So this should also be considered in the methodologies that we are going to implement. And just to give you a bit of data, so some of the recent data that we have just published regarding data collection on institutional mechanisms, so we could grasp that the government's commitment to producing statistics disaggregated by sex, regarding this, we could see that 13 out of the 24 countries that responded to our survey do not have any particular legislation or a high level of agreement requiring such production. 13 out of 24 have this kind of legislation. Still 11 remain with less formal, or some not even have any kind of good intention, recommendation to do this kind of data collection and dissemination disaggregated by sex. We also tried to understand the measures at the national level used so to effectively disseminate statistics disaggregated by sex. And one of the ways was trying to assess the use of websites or specific sessions in the website to disseminate such statistics. For this, we found out that 14 member states have a relevant website or section. Still, 9 remain without any web dissemination. And it's interesting to see that this situation, it's exactly the same like in 2012 when this kind of data collection was done for the first time. So there was not so much progress. This is a bit the big picture. And when we dive into one of our key topics of this forum, which is intersecting inequalities, I can assure you the picture is even worse. Right, Yolanta?
Yes, Yolanta, please.
Okay. Thanks, Ligia. It's indeed, it's very uneasy topic. I would just add that principle of intersecting inequalities is also very well recognized in the international policy processes, and recently at the EU level, it's kind of more explicitly expressed, and there is a higher demand for accountability in terms of the potential to deliver for intersecting inequalities. And as, for example, if we look at Gender Equality Strategy 2020-2025, it actually very clearly acknowledges the importance of intersectionality of gender with other grounds of discrimination, which on the one hand have to inform gender equality policies, but on the other hand, these intersections have to be addressed across other policy areas in the EU. And the strategy promises that the strategic frameworks on disability, LGBTI+, Roma inclusion, and children's rights will be linked with gender equality strategy, but will be also linked to each other. So this is, in a way, very positive development, because if we look historically, the inclusion policies, different inclusion policies, they seldom consider gender as a cross-cutting principle, nor proposed any specific actions how to tackle gender inequalities. EIGE's approach to gender equality also accommodates the intersectional approach, and our analysis extends analysis of inequalities beyond the sole axis, and this approach also helps us to understand how gender inequalities manifest differently across different groups, across different domains, and across different points in time. And you might be aware that Gender Equality Index has intersecting inequalities as a structural part of it. So we are basically, in our analysis, we are analyzing indicators, all Gender Equality Index indicators across different groups. I wanted to just give you one example. Let's say an indicator of full-time employment. This is an indicator of Gender Equality Index. If you look at the first two bars, it's gender gaps in full-time employment equivalent. Full-time employment equivalent is employment rate, which also takes time spent in paid work into account. So here we see like 16 percentage point gender gap to the detriment of women. But then if we start looking into types of families, there the picture becomes more nuanced, okay? There we see that women in couples with children and single women and men, here the gender gaps, they're much, let's say, increase, or the levels also in employment are different. If we look at education as an example, here we also see that generally both women and men with low and medium education are excluded from labor market more than people with tertiary education. But, for example, when it comes to women with low and medium education, they are nearly 2 times more disadvantaged. But I want to say that these are relatively easy categories. These are relatively easy. And we're looking at 5 disaggregations, usually data based on and comparable and reliable data from Eurostat. It's age, disability, family type, migrant background, and education. Sometimes we also rely on data that's provided by fundamental rights agencies, also on ethnicity, race, and ethnicity, LGBTI+. But now I want to mention several issues that were faced. First is limited data availability is a continuous challenge. Limited data availability that in certain areas, gender statistics that Ligia was speaking about, but equality data doesn't even exist. Some areas are really like, we don't really know much on what is happening. We heard about informal care today. We heard about violence against women today. We heard about take-up of parental leaves that we can't really have the full picture about, time use statistics, gender inequalities in digital and green transition, sexual reproductive health, and I could name and name and name because there are really many areas which we don't really have a very complete picture. But even if data is available in those areas, in most cases it does not allow for intersections of more than 2 categories. So we can say how women of certain age is faring, but if you add ethnicity, that's a full stop. We don't know. We don't know how older migrant women are doing. We don't know how older women with disability are doing often, because here we're already speaking about 3 intersections and more. And it's mostly because of small sample sizes that we can't really get the full picture. Secondly, what is also important when we speak about data limitations, but even for some very common categories like disability or migrant background, we actually can't get into details. If for age, we can calculate difference inequalities across different age groups, or for education across different educationists, but for disability, we actually don't know, for example, how different disabilities are kind of, what impact they make. So we don't have more detailed picture of disabilities. We don't have more detailed picture of migrant background, because there are, migrants from third countries. It can be United States, but it can be some other countries which are and they're all pulled into one category. And we are kind of, outside the EU, but outside the EU is what? And then one more aspect of data availability. We know relatively enough about populations 15+, but inequalities start much earlier, and many issues could be analyzed taking children's perspective into account. How much do we know about teenage migrants population, how they fare in the society, or teenage or children who have certain forms of disability, unless I don't have this knowledge myself, but I'm afraid that we really don't know much about it. We know about them from their parents' perspective, but we don't know much from children's perspective. So one more point that I want to say, that the lack of data that I am talking about, it has very serious implications. It basically shows that the principle of intersecting inequalities is not applied across policy areas, it's not mainstreamed, because the lack of data doesn't allow it. And what are the implications of that? The structural nature of inequalities remains unrecognized. The links between inequalities, gender and class, gender and race, remains unrecognized. The links between inequalities across different areas, how gender gaps in care affect gender gaps in energy poverty, how gender gaps in care maybe affect use of transport. Links across areas are also, they remain invisible, because these are not ensured, these are not consistently monitored. And the third thing I want to say, that even if intersecting inequalities are acknowledged in policies, they very often don't translate into monitoring frameworks, even when data allows it, don't translate in monitoring framework or annual assessment reports, because very many indicators that exist at EU level, they are gender blind, equality blind. So we don't monitor. It remains as a general principle in strategy, but in fact, what's the impact on that on life of people, we don't know. So this is for the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Jolanta. Let's give a hand to Ligia and Jolanta. Yeah. Thank you very much. I have to say some very alarming information that you have given us. I mean, first of all, in this 21st century, access to data is difficult. Data does not exist, and the fact that intersectionality isn't really covered in ways that we want. So if you don't have data, you can pretend the problem does not exist, and without data, there's no visibility and no mainstreaming into many of our lives. So this is, I think, a major, I would say, democratic deficit, in a sense, for us as Europeans. Rosalina, I'm going to start a panel now. So once again, the same rules of engagement. I'll ask a few questions of our panelists and then turn to you for your input. Short comments, please, and short questions as well, because otherwise it's not very respectful of me not to give everyone the floor, but also not very nice vis-a-vis your partners who are waiting to ask questions as well. And online, please come in as well. So Rosalina, you've heard rather, as I said, disappointing and I would say also alarming information from Ligia and Jolanta. So what is the Fundamental Rights Agency, and especially your subgroup, which is working on equality data, how are you working to fill the gaps and help the European Commission and the member states, because we are hoping and working towards a union of equality? How are we going to get there without the right data?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I just have to underline all the gaps and the challenges that have been identified by the colleagues of EIGE. And these gaps have been acknowledged long ago from the Fundamental Rights Agency and also from the European institutions, and asking FRA to fulfill its mandate with providing data on groups that are hard to reach or hard to survey, or on subject areas that are usually not covered in the standard data collection exercises that the member states are doing. That means even if data collection exercises are regularly done by Eurostat or by the statistical offices, by administrative data sources, usually they are not making visible the groups that are most at risk of discrimination or unequal treatment, or that are marginalized in one way or the other. And therefore, FRA started to collect that data many years ago, showing the experiences of Roma women, showing the experiences of Muslim women, of black women, of black men and Roma men, of youth, and trying to point to the gaps that are not filled in from other data sources. What is important that acknowledging these gaps, also the European Commission and specifically the high-level group on equality, non-discrimination and diversity set up a subgroup on equality data back then in 2017, end of 2017, and asked FRA to facilitate the work of that subgroup. And members of that subgroup are member states, kind of pretty, I think that at the moment there are more than 20 countries that are members of the subgroup. And also EIGE is part of the subgroup, and FRA to facilitate that work, to help member states and the European institutions to to ease the collection and the use of equality data in different areas of life. And what the subgroup is doing, up to date, the subgroup produced already 2 sets of guiding principles on the collection and use of equality data. And these 2 sets of guiding principles were accompanied by a so-called auditing tool, helping the member states to map all the sources and the data collected in their countries, and also to identify the gaps and to start calling for new data collections, but also guiding the countries how to do the data collection. So how to really
actually training,
how to train them, and to systematize and to standardize the way, for example, how to measure racial and ethnic origin. It is not enough to measure immigrant background, because racism and racial discrimination do not stop with migration background, but they can be really with the second, third,
so you're going
fourth
very granular
generation. Exactly. So you need to collect data that is really allowing to make the discrimination experience and the racialized experience invisible. So I think there is a right to data. It is a right to data to be visible in the data, to make visible the inequalities that a particular group experience. So this right to data have to be eased and facilitated, and that is what the subgroup is trying to do, and the subgroup is pretty successful, because the subgroup was referred to in many of the equality strategies that the Commission has adopted, and asked to continue the work. And now, at the moment, the subgroup is working on a third set of guiding principles, how to collect and use data based on sexual orientation, gender identity, sex characteristics. And this is going to be published, I think, by the end of this year or beginning of the next year. And also what is important is that the subgroup is also conducting country visits, so an exchange of good practices. So members of the subgroup are just visiting another member of the subgroup and learning from their experience. And we just had a very successful country visit to Ireland, organized by the Irish Commission for Human Rights, and it was really well done. And also follow-up from that work is that many countries started to implement these guiding principles, and to use also budget from the Equality and Citizens program of the Commission to start implementing these guiding principles and to increase the collection and use of equality data.
So a lot of work, exchange of information, good practices, and a sense peer pressure as well, I imagine, when you're in a group meeting like that. Rosalina, thank you. We'll come back to some of the details that we'll explore further. So Stefania, you're joining us online. You're working with Eurostat. And of course, Eurostat is the source of a lot of statistics that we employ across all sectors. Journalists do it, policymakers do it, all the agencies do it as well. So I was wondering, how are you at Eurostat working to improve the relevance of gender statistics, intersectionality, and to have, as we were saying, more informed policy making, so we can actually know where the real gaps are? Please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation and for the question. I'm working in the European Union Statistics of Income and Living Conditions. I'm going to give you now a short presentation about what is this survey about. And of course, we are working to improve the visibility of gender gaps and other kind of gaps and inequalities in this survey. And I'm going to show you specifically the different topics that we are also dealing with. So I'm going to tell you very briefly about what is EUSILC. So it's a survey which is multi-purpose in different domains of the income and living conditions. And it's a household survey, so we have household and personal data. It's collected annually for the EU27 member states, and also for the EFTA country, and for most of the candidate countries from a harmonized point of view. We have an harmonized methodology, and all our participants, they are following the same methodology, the same rules, and the same quality requirements. So we have both. We have cross-sectional and longitudinal data. And for the longitudinal data, we can observe the household inside the panel during for 4 or 6 years, depending on the country. We have different kinds of variables. So we have annual variables that they are collected. They are most of the part of our survey. They are almost the 90% of the total variables that we have. And we collect annually data in different domains, in different topics, such as income, deprivation, economic activity, also sociodemographic variables, and so on. You can see all the different main topics that we have in the first column that I have in this table. Then we have a rolling module structure. This is from 2021. That is the year when we implemented the revised survey following the new regulation on social statistics. So we have, in this framework, we have 3 yearly rolling modules and 6 yearly rolling modules. And also we have other policy-based ad hoc modules. So this means that, for example, for the 3 yearly rolling modules or for the 6 yearly rolling modules, this means that every 3 or 6 years, we are going to repeat the same topic, meaning that we are going to collect data in the same topic that I'm showing you in this table. And what are of the modules that I would like to emphasize here in my presentation is the new 6 yearly rolling module that we will have from 2024, which is the access to services module, in which we will have different sections. And one of the sections will be in feeling discriminated. In this section, we will have 4 different questions in which we will ask people from a personal level if they felt discriminated in different points of view, if they felt discriminated when accessing to public services or when accessing to public spaces or when looking for housing or when accessing to education. And then in each of those variables, we will have different categories that if the person has felt discriminated, to indicate what is the main reason of this discrimination because of age or sex or sexual orientation, ethnicity, origin, and so on. So we have the main indicators that we are producing, the main indicators that are used in the framework of the EU 2030 targets on poverty and social exclusion to monitor of the policies that are taking place on that purpose. And the main indicator to do that is the ROP indicator, which is the risk of poverty or social exclusion indicator. In this graph that I'm showing here, we have 3 different main bubbles. Each of the bubble is representing one of the components of the risk of poverty or social exclusion indicator. This indicator is composed by 3 different indicators, being the risk of poverty indicator, which is represented by the yellow bubble. Then we have the deprivation rate, which is severely material and socially deprived rate. I apologize because there is a mistake in the legend of the graph, and the orange one should be not only materially but also socially deprived.
Right.
And then the red, the dark red, is representing the indicator of people living in households with very low work intensity. So the intersections that there are among the 3 bubbles, they are showing that there are people that can be in the 3 categories, or people that can be just in 2 of them, or just in 1. For example, there are 5.9 million people on average in the European Union in 2021 that they were in the three of them. They were at risk of poverty, they were also severely deprived, and they were living in households with very low work intensity.
Okay.
I'm going to show you the result of the indicators.
Stefania, how long is your presentation?
Yes, this slide and another one more.
Okay, I think you'll just have to speed it up a tiny little bit.
Okay, so thank you and sorry for taking time, but here just to show you the result of the main indicator by different breakdowns that we have. In the first bars, we have by sex in 2021 as well, and we can see that there are more females that they are at risk of poverty or social exclusion in Europe than males. Then in this graph, I'm showing you the result of the severe material and social deprivation rate by sex and for 2021 as well. And what we can see is that on average in the European Union and also in almost all countries, European countries, we have that that the probability to be severely deprived is higher in the case of women than in the case of men. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefania. So thank you very much for that information. And I think we're going to look into what are the gaps that exist. And that's why I'm going to turn to you, Pirko. If you come online.
Yes, good afternoon. Are you hearing me all right?
Perfectly. Very clear, Pirko. Good to see you. Great to see
you.
So
great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, and Pirko, you've been listening very patiently to all of this different friends giving their side of what's available in terms of data, what's missing, what needs to be improved. And you're head of the European Disability Forum, so the question to you obviously is, as far as data goes in your sector, the things that relate to you, the intersectionality that you bring in, what is your experience of the existing data and what would you like improved?
The intersectionality is the key. I was going to greet you as one who is actually in majority, because in the disability population, women are the majority. But that also shows us that so much of the information and the experience, lived-in experience of people, these need to be brought together, because the statistics may show that you can't feel cold or you can't feel hunger, and yet in your everyday life you have those experiences. We have been talking about energy crisis today. Is the cost of electricity even included in those cost of living assessments? We are facing new situations. But insofar as from the disability perspective, I would like to also raise the issue that when you're planning these population-wide large surveys and statistics, are you including the many millions of people who live in institutional care? Are they counted? Do they exist? Is their reality visible in the statistics? And more often than not, the answer is no. So if I would take one step further to further gender equality, is I would definitely bring in more intersectional data. And also it was very good from one of the colleagues that it's not only one or two, it's not only sex and gender, but there are other lived experiences as well that may well intersect and interact and create these situations of risk or vulnerability in terms of social exclusion or economic exclusion. So my first point is really to work more on this intersectionality to bring a clearer picture. Secondly, what I think is the second step to take is to include and to have in the process of counting, as statistics is often perceived to be an exercise in counting, to include also the qualitative aspect, the quality of life aspect, lived experience aspect, lived experiences of lack of access to healthcare, for example, or length of waiting. These elements, what you might call social data, to combine these with what some may call hard data, to have a full and complete picture is very important. And in this production of the qualitative data, I think it's crucial that we also highlight the need for the authorities, institutions like FRA and EIGE have already done for many years and very successfully. EIGE in particular, working together with the European Women Lobby to bring about better and more extensive gender data to support the changes in policy that we need to make. And also with the disability movement, I see the problem. I was looking at the new gender equality index and using these intersectional new variables that you could add. And when I put in disability, I have a very disappointing in that data is not available or it's not comparable. So the third step is to work together to improve the collection of data and also to have a more longitudinal. So no snapshots, videos. These are my 3 steps.
Thank you, Pirko. Thank you for bringing your insights. And as you said, we need hard data to have some better policies. And we had talked about this before. We said hard data, but we need that for soft policies to deal with intersectionality. Thank you very much indeed. Ilaria, so to get your comments as well on the need for very intersectional data, going granular, understanding the lived experience, as Pirko said, of people who are in sectors where there is really no recognition in terms of data. So what are your points of view when it comes to the LGBTQI plus community? What would be your aspirations and your asks?
Well, thank you very much, first of all. I think that one of the questions that I am asked more often is why do we need to focus on the intersection, for example, between gender and sexual orientation? Why it is relevant? We have already data dealing with LGBTI community in general. We have already data dealing with women and gender equality. So the women of the LGBTI community should be covered. Actually, what happens is exactly the contrary, is that LGBTI women are not covered in the general LGBTI conversation or not appropriately covered, and then they are not covered enough in the gender equality discussion. So what happens is that this silos approach make those in the intersection fall between the cracks. This is a very common experience for those who find themselves in this intersectional position. And I want to bring here that what happens with the LGBTI community is very, it's not a monolith. That's why we use the acronym. It's not because we like the alphabet a lot. It is because there are very different experiences. And the distribution of inequalities is very often you will find it very often on the same lines that you find inequalities in general. You will find it gender inequalities, you will find inequality based on race or ethnicity, disability, and so on. So we need to have this focus because I think there are 2 reasons. The first one is that we risk to fall between the cracks, and therefore data collection and therefore policy, legislation have gaps, and so there are people who are simply not covered. Yeah. But then the second reason is that by analyzing the intersection, we can understand better certain phenomena. What my experience as a lesbian, who look like a lesbian in when I face gender-based violence, and I face a lot of gender-based violence, what does my experience tell us about gender-based violence in general? What the experience of a trans woman tell us about socioeconomic inequalities? What the experience of a migrant LGBTI people tell us about the system of, for example, asylum and refugee integration in Europe? What does it tell us about the situation of other? What about the experience of disabled LGBTI people? Tell us about the way in which the system of support services for disabled people are built. Often the answer is that those systems are all built having in mind one person who is a white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied man. Yeah. And that needs to change. And in order to change it effectively, we need to have a look at this broader phenomenon. So I think that it's very important that we start really to look at this blind spot, not just as a way to, check our checklist of diversity, but as a way to actually improve our policy making, the legislations, and all our other instruments that we put forward for equality and for gender equality.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. So I'm going to now open the floor to questions and comments. I will go to you, but first, of course, I'm going to turn to our official commentators, Lesia first, and then Kim Suter. So, Lesia, you have a microphone. Thank you very much. If you could perhaps stand up, if it doesn't bother you too much. Yes. So your comments on what? Yes, yeah, that's right. And you can turn around here as well. Swivel around. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you for all your presentations. And this goes along the lines of what we have been trying to do with Commissioner Elena Dalli, is since the beginning of the mandate we have put forward the concept of intersectionality. So meaning that, yes, we had a gender equality strategy, but we had 5 strategies in total. And what was important for us is that they were all linked. So that's within our field of equality, but then there is the rest of the Commission. And there we also wanted to make sure that the gender mainstreaming is happening. So when we talk to our colleagues in different cabinets working on different files and in different sectors, that they also take that notion into consideration. So the work that is being done by EIGE and FRA indeed is very important, because it will enable us to translate the policy proposals that we have and the actions concretely, and addressing it concretely. Because as everybody said here, if we don't have the full picture, we will not be able to address it correctly. I mean, think of violence against women, where disabled women are more at risk than others, or in in gender pay gap, where women of different ethnic background face bigger discrimination. And so we also try to do that in our legislative proposals. And so for the first time, we put forward the notion of intersectionality in our pay transparency proposal. So it's mentioned there, and so member states, when they will have to transpose the proposal, will have to also take that up in their national legislation. So I would say, yes, we need to do more. We need to work hand in hand, policymakers, data collection, and people from the field to highlight those gaps that exist.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lesia. Kim, so from the anti-racism point of view, this missing blind spot of data on people of color, of Europeans of color, in the European Union. When I'm trying to write about these issues, when I write about these issues, statistics are very hard to find.
Yeah, absolutely. And for us, as the European Network Against Racism, it's actually an indicator of systemic racism. The fact that we do not have actually this ability to collect data is just one example of how we make the visible invisible. So for us, what we've been discussing is absolutely critical. And also, for us, actually, the ability to collect data on certain types and not others also creates and is actually an expression of the hierarchy of discriminations that we, as various cross-sectoral organizations, have been trying to push and to say we absolutely need something to do about. But I wanted to also introduce into the conversation as well is that I think sometimes perfection is a bit prevents us from doing more in the space. And I think we need to be a bit more creative, for example, on data sources. So whilst the statistical officers might not be able to collect this information, perhaps there are other sectors which could. So what is the role of private sector to actually fill in those data gaps? To what extent can we make we've been focusing very much on the top down. So how do we make sure that the top can provide this information that comes down? But how can we actually elevate the information that's coming from the grassroots and give it the legitimacy it deserves? Because we actually have a lot of information, but the difficulty is to legitimize it, to legitimize the ad hoc, and to actually make the ad hoc speak with the more broader statistical information. So I think that's a really important element to do so that we don't get stuck in the situation of, as was mentioned, that we've been talking about getting data for nearly 8 years and we're still stuck at the same starting point. But I think there's actually a lot of ability to be creative, and I think there's a need for a political signal to say that actually we're able to all stakeholders that not only do we want this data, we need this data, but also you're able to collect this data. And at the moment, I think there's a lot of messages which prevents us saying that we cannot collect it on the basis of GDPR or whatever. And I think there's a real need for the political signal to say, actually, no, we want all of us to be able to collect this information for the benefit of all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kim. So basically, EU entering the 21st century in terms of collecting data on the reality of the intersectional questions that are so much of a lived experience of so many people. Thank you very much indeed for that. I had seen a couple of hands go up there as well. There was a person over there who first raised her hand. Please, could you stand up perhaps? Yeah. And then I saw someone here. Is there anyone coming online? I'm happy to take questions there as well. Please.
I'd like to thank the panelists for a brilliant discussion on a very important, I think, key topic that we have only started to resolve. My name is Sanya Nicola, and I come from the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. We operate in 57 states, including EU member states. And as Kim said, we need to be creative, so we tried to be, and we created a new tool. It's called Gender Benchmarking Tool. And we're hoping that EIGE will be a reviewer along with UN Women one day. But the idea is really to boost the appetite of states to produce gender data and to talk about gender data. Data is only a trigger, really, for policy discussions. So we tried to look at it upside down and to look for positive examples of breakthrough leadership in gender equality. Right. But we're also looking at gender structures and other criteria. So just flagging that there are ideas that are connected. We paid attention not to duplicate with Gender Equality Index, so it complements it, and I'm hoping we'll all be able to use it.
Right, no, absolutely, because it is about working across sectors and not in silos, so that's really important. There was a person over here as well. Please, if you stand up, my colleague can see you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. There were so many amazing points picked up on there. My name's Hannah Manza. I work at the Violence and Society Centre in London, and we're actually working on quite a large project looking at how to improve data, specifically on violence and really focusing on inequalities. And I guess my question is, how do we kind of balance out data comparability cross-country and over time with the kind of need for in-depth data, not only looking at violence against women in terms of women versus men, but in terms of gender dimensions of violence, the severity, the frequency, the different forms of violence, as well as the kind of demographic realities in countries. So if we want to have comparable data across the EU, there is a kind of sense of one country might prioritize categorizing migrants in this way or ethnicity in this way. And I kind of take Kim's point in terms of not wanting to get bogged down in perfectionism over it. So how do you guys kind of see that need to balance out comparability with good quality data?
Thank you very much for that question, and I'm happy to take one more question if there is one from the floor, and there's a person, right, okay, two. No, I thought, is there someone raising their hands there? Okay, please go ahead, and then the person at the back, and that's it, yeah. Thank you. Short questions, please, so I can go back to the panel.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask the panel what your views were about creating mandates for the collection of equality data in national legislation. We've had some experience in Ireland on our hate crime legislation, but we've also had experiences where the police service for Ireland is very resistant to collecting equality data, and therefore we're trying to create a legal obligation in national legislation so that they have to collect data. So just your views on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And person at the back, thank you for standing up. Wonderful. Yes, and then I'll go back to the panel. And when you answer, panel online as well, please give in your 3 steps forward as well.
So I'll be very quick. I just want to hear if you have any reflections on sensitivity of data, and especially around ethnic minorities.
Sorry, just repeat that, please.
So the sensitivity of data, and I'm thinking actually especially about the Roma community, as having experience with working with data disaggregation around Roma, and how you'd approach the sensitivities of data collection.
Right, thank you very much. So I'm going to go back to you first. Maybe, Jolanta, we go linear, and then, well, maybe not linear. I'll bring in Pirko as well. So if you want to answer some of the questions.
Yeah, I will try to connect with my 3 steps forward, okay? Because one point was mentioned about indeed an obligation for data collection, and actually what I thought of, and I think it's very important, is that that countries' policies and legislative processes, they have to be supported by certain like economic, but also coordination instruments. First of all, there have to be indeed commitment, political commitment to data collection. Then there have to be resources allocated, human and financial. Certain training has to be ensured, and certain accountability and monitoring has to be provided. So this is very important that policies work, of course, across policy areas. There was a certain coordination mechanism established that this could then be kind of reflected in data collection exercises, and then certain accountability has to be provided. It's a bit like nothing new really, because when we speak about, for example, gender mainstreaming, how gender mainstreaming has to be implemented, yes, we need institutional mechanisms in place in order to, gender statistics, now I'm speaking just about gender statistics, is a part of gender mainstreaming. If you don't have gender statistics, you can't implement it. But for gender mainstreaming, there has to be certain preconditions in place, because otherwise it's not going to work out. Then my second thing is, I think it's very important when we speak about this data concerning different groups, is to have those groups also engaged in data collection exercise. We need women's organizations, the LGBTI organizations, we need grassroots and other civil society organizations to be a part of that exercise. Recovery Resilience Facility, which was launched, which was announced in Europe, and then you probably know as a follow-up, national recovery plans were drafted by countries. And one of the requirements, or not requirement, but recommendation for the process itself was that civil society organizations have to be engaged in that. They have to have their voice in how recovery and resilience facility plans will be implemented. Look, I will not announce results yet, it's too early, but my very initial assessment, our very initial assessment, is that results are going to be very poor, because civil society organizations, largely speaking, were not actually engaged in that process of expressing their needs, establishing monitoring frameworks, tools.
And whose fault was that? Whose fault was that? Who didn't engage? Was it the civil society, or was it the outreach to civil society?
Yeah, so governments in a way had to ensure a mechanism where the civil society would be a part of that.
Yeah.
So the fact that they were not engaged, of course, its reasons might differ country by country, but I think overall, largely, we can say that they were out of that process.
Right.
So I think it's very important to have this kind of engaging approach, and that also links what was said about the quality of data, because the quality of data is, as I always say, it's not that we do a perfect disaggregation at the end of the exercise. It's not about perfect disaggregations based on these inequalities. They have to be a part of concept. If they are not a part of concept, it's not even measured. It's this disaggregation that we do, then that will not even matter for that. So it's from step A. It has to be. It has to be reflected.
I'll have to stop you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry
Okay.
because I'm running out of time and I have other people to come in. But your point is very well taken. Inclusive data collection is basically what you're saying in order to go more granular. Yes, Ligia. Do you want to come in on any of the points that have been raised?
Yes, they are, maybe a little trying to wrap up from Yolanda afterwards. There are two main points I would like to pick here.
Yeah.
One was mentioned actually from our commentator, and there's this issue about having a lot of grassroots initiatives which are not considered and could probably be considered for providing better statistical information afterwards. We have some good examples at EIGE. It's not always possible, but it is also possible. That's what I mean. On the other hand, this balance between comparability and the quality of data, it's exactly the challenge. So to take these grassroots initiatives, because indeed, there is a lot of data. There is a lot of information that is produced and could be used as statistical information afterwards. What is lacking here is the coordination on one hand. And for these instances like EIGE, for example, can have a say. Of course, this is subject to the availability of resources afterwards.
Right.
But this is one point that we can pick, and we can, and then the sensitivity of data, if I may. This is also a very good point. This is what I mentioned, and what Yolanda now was reiterating, that it is very important since the very beginning, the concept for that we go through, the definition that we are going to measure afterwards. It is very important that the initial of the statistical activity, it is already gendered, that the gender perspective is there, because otherwise we are going to have a lot of data that it is not serving the purpose afterwards. And it's not good quality afterwards, because if it doesn't have a gender perspective, we cannot say fully that it is good quality.
Exactly. You cannot mainstream gender into all your policies if the data and evidence is not there. I'll go to Pirko. Pirko first, please, and then come to the panel as well.
Yes, thank you. I can just agree with what colleagues have been saying. I would take up the issue of sensitivity and the GDPR, because often I think we need to start thinking about why we need the data. We need the data in order to improve policies, and to improve the policies, we must consider: is it more important to know how many disabled people there are and not know because it's sensitive for me to tell you that I'm disabled? You don't see my wheelchair now, but if I were in the room, you would like earlier it was said that the first thing you see is the gender and the color of your skin. With me, it's the chair, and often it is only the chair that is seen. So that is a future challenge for all of us, to try and if we are trying to make more inclusive, more accessible Europe, we need to make it so that the disability perspective and the access perspective is fully included.
Thank you, Pirko.
For that, we need to work together. Thank you.
Thank you. Having met you, Pirko, I can tell you the chair is not the first thing you see. It's you. Thank you very much indeed. Let me now go to Stefania. Stefania, some comments from, some reactions to the comments?
Thank you very much. I also agree totally with my colleagues here that we need to work forward into more granularity data. From the point of view of harmonized surveys across different countries, what we find is that sometimes also the regulation limits us. We cannot go forward or beyond because also when we go for questions that they are sensible, it's difficult to introduce this kind of question into household questionnaires.
Right.
And also in some countries it's also forbidden. And so, as I said, we are working forward to have more information on that. For that, we also had this first approach with more detailed information in this access to services module that we will have in 2024. For the annual perspective, for all the indicators that we have, we always disseminate them by gender, sex, age, and also we have the main indicators like AROPE, also disaggregated for people with disabilities. And also regarding one question that it was in the audience about gender violence statistic, I would like to say as information that Eurostat is working in the framework of the gender equality strategy for the 2020-2025, that they are developing the gender violence survey, which started to develop it in 2016. And then it developed as a pilot study from 2017 to 2019, interviewing households for 14 different countries.
Right. Okay.
I know directly related to this survey, but it's conducted in the unit that I'm working. Yeah. So if you want more information, you can later address to me the questions. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Stefania. So a step forward. Thank you very much. So, Rosalina, having heard from the audience and our panelists, it's this the lack of data on gender equality that exists in certain areas, on intersectionality. Is it a political decision not to have this data?
Yes, I would like to maybe also to take some of the questions that came out from the people who are attending the panel. I think important is to realize that equality data costs and intersectionality costs. That means to have clear data that allows you to do intersectional analysis, because intersectionality as an analytical tool needs to have enough data to disaggregate along all the protected characteristics, plus in addition to collect information about experiences of discrimination, bias-motivated harassment, bias-motivated crime and violence. So you need not only to understand intersectionality from the legal point of view, because there should be a definition, what is an intersectional discrimination, in comparison to multiple discrimination, which is already covered in EU legislation, but it is intersectional discrimination is not covered. That means you cannot separate the grounds as they intersect. And I will give you one example. Roma women and their life expectancy is with 11 years lower than women from the general population. Roma men life expectancy 9.1 year lower than men from the general population on average. This is new data that is just going to be published by FRA. However, there was a question how to deal and how to go about sensitive information, and very often this argument is built into the reflection of not to collect that data or to forbid that data collection. So sensitive personal data is protected through the European Data Protection Regulation, through the national data protection legislations, through the Charter. However, it is not forbidden, and it is the GDPR does not stay in the way to collect such data. You need, every data collection need to follow and to respect the human rights-based principle to data. That means of doing no harm, not to reinforce existing stereotypes, existing prejudice, existing inequalities through the data collection, but to use that data to increase the situation of marginalized or people at risk. And within that human rights-based principle to data is also the accountability principle and the credibility principle. So you need, as Iris asked, you need to have maybe legal obligation not only to collect data, but to have legal obligation, as Ireland has and UK, from public bodies to report on equality on a regular basis. And in order to report on, to monitor the state of equality, you need comprehensive data sources, and I agree fully with you. It's not enough just statistical data from the national statistical offices, although they are very relevant, because otherwise you cannot describe the composition of a population if you miss sexual orientation, if you miss gender identity beyond binary understanding of gender identity. If you miss information on racial and ethnic origin and only collect proxies like migrant background, you cannot describe the composition of your population. And if you cannot describe it, you're making it not visible. Exactly. So the obligation would ask you to collect data by police and how police is going during police stops. You would need data how a case of hate crime is traveling through the judicial system. So you need information from the judicial system, you need information from prisons, you need information from surveys, you need information from equality bodies, all that combined. So it's not enough to have one source and one survey repeated maybe every 5 years. This is important, but this is in combination in order to talk about the state of equality in a country. And then what is very often missing is that we have enough data that we do not use for reporting on equality. Right. For example, access to employment rates, as I said, life expectancy. But if you don't have these background variables, you cannot show. Right. And as I said, it is important to follow up the human rights-based principle, and you can, given all the data protection, you can collect such data for reporting purposes, and you need that data to develop also human rights-based indicators on such data.
That's a very, very important point, Rosalina. Thank you for coming in, because often it's used as an excuse, isn't it, that we cannot have data on this. We cannot have data on that. It's personal, protection, privacy laws, etc. So thank you for making that point. Very important point. Ilaria, your 3 steps forward.
So I also taking from some of the things that have been said. I think the perfectionist problem is a problem that I relate a lot with, because that's something that we are told a lot, that we cannot have good enough data, so let's not take data. Then there is no data about specific experience, for example, in our case, of lesbian women or non-binary people. I think we need to face the fact that maybe hard data are not always the key. I know that this is maybe a bit controversial here, but we need to acknowledge the fact that when we speak about minorities, strength cannot be in numbers, has also to be in personal experience, lived realities. And of course, numbers are important, and of course, there is need to work more on making quality data more aware of the gender of the gender dimension of things, so that make sure that when you look at minorities, you also look at the women or non-binary people of those minorities. But we also need to make gender data, the data that concern gender equality, more aware of the minorities. There was a survey done 10 years ago already by FRA on violence against women. And of 40,000 responded, only 500 identified themselves as non-heterosexual women. Only 500. So that survey is on violence against straight women. Very interesting, very important, but we need to be aware of the fact that there is a gap there. And then, of course, I think the third issue is that we need to engage, you need to engage with civil society. You need to engage with us. That survey of FRA having only 500 lesbian, I'm sure that lesbian organizations around Europe could have helped in reaching much more than 500. I can probably reach 500 lesbian myself. Maybe not 500, but 200, yes.
Yeah, good point.
So it's important to engage with civil society. It's important to engage with those parts of the community that are most affected by the phenomenon that we are trying to analyze. It's fundamental that we are included in the design of the instruments that we want to use, and also in the outreach, because we see very often that this is the issue. Right. The community who are most marginalized are those that are also most difficult to reach, and then their data are, again, always invisible. Right. So these are my 3 points.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. So, Rosalina, you can come in, but very quickly, because I see that we're moving on to the next slot. So please, very quickly.
Very quickly, because I think I didn't reply to one of the questions, but also to link to what Ilaria said. The participatory principle is another principle of the human rights-based principles to data, and I think important also to mention that FRA tries to do it very systematically, but also invites the countries to do so, and with this to, for example, in 2020, FRA, together with the Commission, revived the Roma Working Party, where the countries and the data collectors are coming, and specifically representatives of the Roma community, to develop the indicators that are used also to monitor the Roma inclusion. And also with regard to the upcoming LGBTIQ survey of FRA, it is important to involve the communities in the design, in the implementation, but also to increase the comparability across, not only within a country, but also across the countries. And to reply to your question, it is important to have combinations of indicators and measurements. So you might use comparable measurements in order to compare across countries. Right. It is important to have them, but to analyze comprehensively the national data, you can combine it with national specific measurements that are needed for monitoring the national measures and policies.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all panelists. So Pirko, Stefania, Rosalina, Ilaria, Ligia, and Jolanta. So I think if we're talking about 3 steps forward in this data and evidence building for policymakers, I think all of you have said, so standardize and systemize equality data collection at the member state level and at the EU level. I think this is something that's been highlighted by all of you, also by the audience. Join forces to bring intersectionality in quantitative and quality data collection and use to the forefront. So produce more, sort of like a virtuous circle, actually. And then broaden data collection, which you've talked about, CSOs being involved, NGOs being involved in the monitoring, in the design, and also in the implementation. So thank you very much indeed for what for me has been an extremely informative session. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to you for your questions and your interest. So let's give ourselves a big round of applause.